real estate investors, they're very interested in Cleveland because they can buy properties there for $20,000 and rent them out for $800 a month and make a killing. Of course, there's a high risk involved with that kind of investment. But for the buying, the real estate market, people who are buying and selling, it's still very tough there, and so people are not seeing their home values recover as quickly.
On the list, then the one item that would stand out is Las Vegas, which I don't. Do they deem that West? Is that the Lawrence Yun definition of the West Coast as well? I don't ever know if they
I would believe that would
loop it.
fall into the Western region,
Right.
yes. And
It's the only thing that hasn't recovered in the West, more or less.
yeah, more or less, it's you see some of the inland. It's basically the farther you get away from the coast of California, the more underwater. It's the reverse of the actual.
The
The more
ironic,
underwater
the
you get,
ironic
yeah.
inverse.
Uh, and and you do see so the first kind of tier of cities in the Central Valley and the Southern California Inland Empire, those have a higher percentage of homes underwater as well, but not as high as Las Vegas. And the curious thing about Las Vegas is if you look at home prices there, they're strong. I mean, they've been appreciating for 48 plus months in Las Vegas for over 4 years, and yet they're still not over out of their home equity hole, and that's just a testament to how bad things got in Las Vegas during the downturn and how much value was lost. Um, and even with all these home price gains that we're seeing there, the equity has not returned for many homeowners.
Now, by the same token, while we're on this, I should say, in this same general vicinity, when you're talking foreclosure states, which again, Realty Track and Darren put out just a few weeks ago for the second quarter, Delaware and New Jersey and Maryland, and you're looking at those places on the far East Coast being the top foreclosure states, but they aren't the worst in equity. Although Nevada makes the list at number four. So
Yeah,
clearly across the board, it's a mess. And on both lists, Florida shows up. So it's still having struggling problems, obviously. But Chicago, Illinois, Ohio, they're further down on the list. It's more of an East Coast thing. The staggering one that I found was Delaware. One
yes.
out of every roughly 500 homes is in default.
Yeah, it's Delaware was is a bit of a a dark horse, I guess, if you will, in terms of the foreclosure rate. If you look historically, it has been creeping up the list over the last few years. And yeah, there's overlap there between these markets that are still struggling with home equity and the markets that are struggling with foreclosure, but it's not complete overlap for sure. And the markets that tend to be the common theme with the markets that are still struggling with foreclosure tends to be those that had the most intervention into the foreclosure process, the so-called judicial foreclosure states, of which Delaware is one, and kind of that political stance toward foreclosures that tends to be more prevalent in the Northeast of, you know, every foreclosure is a bad, every foreclosure is bad,
Right.
and so we should try to prevent every foreclosure, as opposed to the more laissez-faire approach in even places like Nevada to a certain extent, but more like places like Arizona where, hey, we're going to let the market bottom out on its own. So those northeastern states, in a sense, you could say their strategy worked, the extend and pretend strategy,
Yes.
because home prices did not fall as precipitously because you didn't see that huge wave of foreclosures hit all at once. And at least in part, that's why home prices did not see as big of a decline. And so home equity has been able to bounce back more quickly, but then you still have this really long tail of deferred foreclosure
Right.
activity that's kind of being trickled out as opposed to having the band-aid ripped off. I apologize for the mixed metaphor there, but
No, no, no. You and I have
that's what
been
we see.
talking about that topic for 5 years. Of this is This whole market is a story of deferral, and it only seems to, honestly, at this point, it only seems to have fallen through on a select number of states and a select number of cities. I mean, as a whole, the plan of maintaining a low interest rate, deferring all the REOs out to third parties, and not letting those come back onto the market, it's really only affected a select number of markets. By and large, it's increased the value of homes and really kept the market from crashing completely.
Yeah, I think I would have doubted this 5 years ago
You did
if I
doubt
had
it
said
5
it,
years
but
ago.
yes. But the extend and pretend strategy, you could say, uh, worked. I think in that respect, and another big thing that I still think I would love more clarity on. Our data, unfortunately, doesn't speak to it as much as I'd like. Is the deferral in the form of
Yeah,
non-performing loans being sold
to third parties.
to third
I
parties.
agree with you. I think the problem that Lawrence is having over at NAR, the your data sources, as well as my studies, and I guess that's what I'd call it, or fascination, I think would be correct at this point. Uh, we're not looking, if we're having a supply and demand issue, and that's really what's happening with home appreciation. It's strictly supply and demand. Uh, I would like to know how many did the REO market really account for that much of the lost data? How much of that is adjusted data? How much is really coming back to the market? How much is really being sold to equity firms? And I don't, do you ever think we're going to get the real answer to that?
Probably not. I think one thing that was somewhat overlooked is we did see a surge in REOs last year.
Yes.
Now that's calmed down a bit, but we definitely saw about a 12-month surge in REO activity, and that didn't make a lot of sense. And I do think that was partially kind of the first wave of those non-performing loans coming through and being foreclosed on by the new firms that own them. Because if you look at a lot of the names in our data behind those REOs, you're going to see names like Lone LSF, which is Lone Star, the Lone Star Fund,
Right.
which bought up a lot of those, and some other names that are not the big banks who are foreclosing. So I think it's very possible we could see some other waves like that come through of REOs. And again, it's a long tail type of situation as opposed to um, a tsunami all at once.
I agree. And based on what I can tell so far, and I'm sure you get this question, I get this question as a former banker, which is, well, how do I get a hold of REOs? And I would, and I'm wondering from your perspective, it's nearly impossible to consistently predict getting your hands on REOs. It is, it from my perspective, it looks like a big boy game being played on Wall Street with equity firms. Is that how you see it?
Yes, for the most part, I think the agents who are in already are still sitting pretty. I mean, especially in places like the Northeast,
Right.
with in terms of from the perspective is of that you want REOs to list, but for the most part, it is yeah the players have already been decided in large part on the REOs. I would pretty much agree with that, and you just don't see the volume. There, the volume is coming through in smaller batches when it does hit REO. But certainly, I think it's never gonna completely go away for sure, and there's gonna continue to be an elevated level of REO. When we look at foreclosure starts in our July numbers, properties starting the foreclosure
Mm-hmm.
process, those nationwide are at an 11-year low.
Right.
But REOs are still, even though they're coming down, they're still elevated.
Right.
It's kind of like a low grade fever type of situation with REOs that could continue to last for the next couple of years, but it's tough
The
to break into that.
strategy is held up. I mean, as long as they don't change the interest rate or have a sudden flood of properties hit the market, or God forbid somebody crazy does. I had hypothesized this with on a couple of calls, which is if they bring back lower lending standards, like no docs and low docs and Alt A and subprime, uh, they are lighting the match to a fuse that I don't think that they can handle. But if they keep it exactly it is as it is, or even bring the interest rate up a half or even a full point up, they could freeze it in time almost, couldn't they? I mean, I don't know enough about the economy in general on that level. I mean, I can only look at it from a banking perspective or a realtor perspective. But it would seem to me that if you brought the interest rate up, just the threat of it alone would kind of freeze the market where it is, and that seems to be a fairly healthy thing.
Yes, yes, I think that this market is pretty interest rate sensitive. Um, so bringing the interest rate up would have a chilling effect on the market,
And it
which
gives the builders a
isn't,
chance to catch up. Certainly, I at some
yeah,
point
it's
they've
not
got to figure
necessarily a
that out.
bad thing
Yeah,
to do that.
I think they have to figure that out at some point. However, I'm going to segue into two other articles, one on Market Watch. Darren has been all over the place. And by the way, if you want to, let me do a plug gratuitously for Realty Track here. If you want to see Realty Track in action and their data, go to my website, honish.com, click on the link that says Monster. Watch the first 15 minutes. You will watch me using the Mega System and pulling up numbers, and I cannot stress it enough. Just sign up, go to mega.realtytrack.com. It's free. Do searches, look at the numbers. Uh, Boy, it's a lot of listings that you guys should really consider. We were just talking about this before we started. I still think that most realtors and investors are just gun shy when it comes to the world of default. I think you're missing out on based on the number of foreclosures, there are a lot of listings that should have happened. That would be my answer.
Yes, I think that's true. And even though pre-foreclosure, or what we call foreclosure, starts at an 11-year low,
It's a
they're
lot.
still there.
It's a
And
half a
there's,
million. It's a
yeah,
crazy number in the U.S.
I mean,
Uh,
it was 36,000 in July alone. That's an 11-year low, but it's not a market.
it's
It's
still
definitely
three point
healthy.
five percent of the market or something insane like that.
Yeah. And, if you're complaining about inventory, I just want to make 2 points on that. You're complaining about inventory and not having enough inventory to list. That that's kind of, to me, a no-brainer to go after those folks
Have
who
to sell.
really need to list.
Yeah,
Yeah. And the other point is, if you don't like short sales, it's really not
you
all
don't have
about
to
short
worry.
sales anymore.
Right.
Most of these, actually, the majority of these people now, and this is not the way it was a few years ago, these people who are falling into pre-foreclosure have equity in their homes, so they're not having to resort to a short sale.
Yeah, I think since we've worked together and talked about your data, I think it was 100% underwater to 90 to 80. I think it's 30% or maybe underwater in some of these markets. It's like 20 to 30%. It's almost a non-existent number. But it has been phenomenal to watch it, and the manipulation of the manipulation's the wrong word, but it's certainly a very surgical repair job to keep this market afloat. I don't know if that's attributed to the president or to the Fed or to Fannie or Freddie or whomever. Um, I started in '88, and I've watched where you just bottom out and you see what the bottom looks like. Somebody big comes in and buys up all the REOs. They disperse those back on the market, and you start the cycle again. This time around, it was kind of the same, but they didn't ever allow there. I think I've had this question with you before. We never really saw a bottom, did we?
Not a true bottom. The Yeah, the 2010, we saw foreclosures drop off a cliff at the end of 2010 for what I would call artificial reasons,
Right.
uh, intervention on the part of the government, and uh, they never. And then we saw a pick back up in 2012, but yeah, it never really fell completely off the cliff. There was a safety net there that in terms of foreclosures fell off the cliff, but the market really never fell off a cliff, which which the foreclosure trend is indicative of. And I do think it was because of strong government
I do
intervention,
too. I do too.
for
I
sure.
It might be that loan mods might be the single greatest government incentive to a bank ever created for salvaging a market. I don't know who the original author of the concepts were by giving some kind of subsidy back to getting the banks to doing the loan modification, but it certainly allowed a spreader theory or